I want to start this one with something small. Not a dramatic mistake, not the kind of mistake where the whole investigation falls apart. This was more ordinary than that. We named a server too early. The IP was 195.201.104.53, a Hetzner box in Germany, not a name anyone remembers. So in the notes, it became something easier. The FTP server. And honestly, that was a reasonable name at the time. That was how the machine entered the case. It showed up as a place where stolen material was being collected. Old file transfer infrastructure, team-scoped access, victim data organized in a way that matched the campaign's internal structure. So the label made sense. FTP server. Move on. Except later, that label started getting in the way. Because once you name a thing, you start seeing it through that name. If you call something an FTP server, you think of storage, a place where files land, a sink, the end of a pipeline. But this machine was not the end of anything. It was part of something larger. And the annoying part is that the original label was not exactly wrong. That is what made it dangerous. It was correct enough to survive, but it was too small. Now, the obvious question is, okay, so what happened? Did we just scan the server and find other ports? And yes, looking at what else is listening on a host is basic work. Everybody does that. That is not the story. Open ports by themselves do not mean much. Any messy server can have extra services running. A half-deployed web app, a test process, an admin panel someone forgot, some random thing installed by a hosting image. So the question was not, does this machine have more stuff on it? The question was, does the other stuff belong to the same operation? Does it carry campaign logic? Does it match the way the malware collects? Does it line up with the team structure? Does it explain behavior that FTP alone does not explain? That is where the name started to break. Because the FTP path explained one part of the operation. It explained how some stolen material landed. It explained why the server mattered as a collection point. But it did not explain everything else the host was doing. There was another layer. Different services, different collection behavior, different tooling family, same host. And at that point, the question changed. It was no longer, what is this FTP server? It was, how many jobs does this server have? That is the story in this episode. Not a magic scan, not a port list, not a victory lap because a machine had more services than expected. This is about misclassification, how a correct label can still mislead you, how infrastructure gets named by the first role investigators understand, and how, in this case, one boring FTP box turned out to be a map of the campaign's second layer. This is the fake interview. Let's back up to how this server entered the story, because that matters. Infrastructure does not usually arrive as a clean diagram. It arrives sideways. One artifact points to another. A log points to a host name. A saved connection points to an IP address. A folder name shows up twice. You follow whatever thread is available, and when that thread leads somewhere useful, you give the destination a name so the rest of the investigation can talk about it. That is what happened here. The machine was not introduced to us as a mystery. It was introduced as a collection point, a place connected to file transfer, a place operators use to receive material from compromised machines. So it got the obvious label, FTP server. The name was practical. It was short. It told everyone on the investigation team why the box mattered. If someone said, check the FTP server, everyone knew which host they meant. That is useful. You need labels like that when the corpus is growing faster than you can write clean prose around it. But there is a trap there. A label is supposed to be a handle. It is not supposed to become the truth. And in threat hunting, that difference is easy to forget. You find a server through one behavior, and then your brain quietly decides that behavior is the server's identity. That is fine when the infrastructure is simple, but this campaign was not simple. By this point in the investigation, the fake interview operation had already stopped looking like one malware family and one server. We had seen staged repositories, browser theft, pastebin-style dead drops, blockchain dead drops, Vercel-based delivery, command and control infrastructure, FTP collection, and operator machines that were themselves being swallowed by the collection pipeline. So a server having more than one role should not have been surprising. But it was still easy to miss because the first role was so clear. If a host is collecting stolen files over FTP, you do not need a poetic name for it. You call it the FTP server. And then later, when the same IP starts showing up in a different context, you have to fight your own note-taking. You have to ask a very basic question. Are we looking at a second server, or are we looking at the same server doing a second job? FTP is old technology. It is not exciting. It is not elegant. It is not the part of the story where people usually lean forward. But for this kind of operation, boring can be useful. Malware collects files. Operators need somewhere to put them. FTP gives them a blunt answer. Connect, authenticate, upload, leave. That is not the same thing as command and control. A command and control server is interactive. It can keep state. It can answer beacons. It can send tasks. It can receive results. It can be part of a live relationship between an infected machine and the operator. A file transfer sink is simpler. It is a landing zone. The malware does its theft somewhere else, then pushes the loot to the server. The operator comes back later, reviews what arrived, and decides what to do next. In this investigation, that distinction mattered because different parts of the campaign used different collection patterns. Some tooling fit the old file drop model. Some tooling did not. So when we first saw this server in the FTP context, the conclusion was straightforward. This is where material is being dropped. That is an important role, but it is a passive one. It made the server feel like the end of a path. The victim runs the fake interview code. The stealer collects. The data is uploaded. The files land on the FTP server. End of chain. Except investigations punish that kind of neatness. The more evidence we pulled into the timeline, the less the server looked like a clean endpoint. It was connected to operator workflow. It carried team structure. It was associated with multiple malware families in the broader corpus, and it had services that did not fit the mental model of a file bucket. That does not automatically mean every service was malicious. That is an important point. If you look at any compromised or operator-controlled server, you will find noise. You will find default services, experiments, broken deployments, stale processes, development leftovers, and software that has nothing to do with the thing you care about. So the standard cannot be, there are more ports, therefore there is more campaign. That is how you overclaim. The standard has to be harder. Does the service behavior match the campaign? Does the naming align with team assignments? Does the data flow make sense with the malware? Does the same host sit in the path for more than one part of the operation? Only then does the label start to fail. And with this server, it did. Here is the part I want to be careful about. It would be very easy to make this sound more dramatic than it was. We discovered hidden services. The server revealed itself. A secret layer was exposed. That is not really how this works. The work is less cinematic. You take the IP, you look at the services, you compare them against what you already know. You throw out the parts that are probably noise. You hold back on anything that is only supported by one source. You check whether older notes got something wrong. And then, if the remaining pieces still line up, you let yourself change the label. That is what happened here. The important discovery was not that 195.201.104.53 had non-FTP services. The important discovery was that some of those services had campaign meaning. They matched collection behavior. They matched team-linked infrastructure. They matched the presence of another tooling family that did not fit neatly into the original FTP story. And that meant the server was not just a storage endpoint. It was a shared operational node. Now, that phrase is less catchy than FTP server, but it is closer to the truth. A shared operational node can do more than one thing. It can receive files for one piece of malware while hosting upload services for another. It can be boring in one context and active in another. It can look like an endpoint if you only follow one path, and like a junction if you follow the rest. That was the shift. We were not asking whether FTP existed. It did. We were asking whether FTP was enough to describe the machine. It was not. And that changed how we thought about the campaign. Because if one host carries multiple collection roles, then the infrastructure is not just a list of boxes. It is a map of operator decisions. What they centralize, what they split, what they reuse, what they deploy together, what they trust to sit on the same machine. Those choices tell you something about the people running it. Not their names, not their location, not by themselves, but their operating model. And that is what we were trying to understand. To understand why the other services mattered, you need to know about OtterCookie. In the earlier parts of this investigation, Beavertail was the thing we kept running into. JavaScript malware, fake job interviews, malicious repositories, developer machines, stolen credentials. But then another family appeared. OtterCookie. And it did not behave exactly the same way. OtterCookie was not just another Beavertail. The code structure was different. The communication pattern was different. The capability set was different. It had broader collection behavior, key logging, screenshots, clipboard monitoring, wallet extension theft, VM checks, persistence mechanisms. So when OtterCookie showed up in the infrastructure, it was not a minor variant. It meant the campaign had another layer, another tool for a different kind of collection. Now here is where the FTP label becomes a problem. If the server is only an FTP sink, then OtterCookie does not really belong in that story, unless it is also dropping files over FTP. But if the same host is carrying services that line up with OtterCookie style collection, then the picture changes. The host is no longer just a place where one malware family sends stolen files. It becomes shared infrastructure. Same machine, different collection behavior, different tooling assumptions. That matters because shared infrastructure is not accidental in a campaign like this. Operators can spread services across many hosts. They can separate malware families. They can isolate collection paths. They can burn one server without touching another. Sometimes they do. But when they place multiple roles on one host, they are making a trade-off. It is convenient. It is cheaper. It is easier to manage. It may fit whatever deployment script or operator workflow they already have. But it also links things. It gives investigators a bridge. And in this case, that bridge connected the old FTP story to the newer OtterCookie story. The server had become more interesting, not because it was exotic, but because it was practical. It was a workbench, a place where more than one part of the operation touched the same surface. Let me pause here, because this is where a technical listener might be rolling their eyes a little. Okay, you found more ports on a server. Congratulations. Welcome to day one. Fair. That is the correct skeptical reaction. Finding open services is not a story. The internet is full of exposed services. Some are malicious. Some are admin mistakes. Some are staging leftovers. Some are things that only look interesting because you are already looking for a pattern. So if all we had was a scan result, this episode would not exist. The reason it matters is correlation. One service by itself is a weak signal. A service that matches known malware behavior is stronger. A service that also lines up with team assignment, collection flow, and prior infrastructure patterns is stronger again. And when the same host already appears in the operator workflow as an exfiltration point, the question becomes legitimate. Is this a pile of unrelated services? Or is this the same operation using one host for multiple jobs? That is the difference between scanning and investigation. Scanning gives you a surface. Investigation gives that surface meaning, or refuses to. And refusing matters. Some claims in the corpus did not survive review. Some notes treated ports as FTP, like when later analysis said they were HTTP. Some victim counts got inflated because numbers from panel dumps were mixed with numbers from FTP directories. One credential rotation note may have been based on testing the wrong password. Those are not details to hide. They are exactly the kind of mess that happens when an investigation is moving fast and the evidence comes from different waves, different operators, different tools, and different analysts. The cleanup is part of the story, because the final claim has to be narrower than the raw corpus. Not everything on this box was part of the campaign. Not every early count was right. Not every port label was correct. The safer claim is this: the original FTP label was correct, but incomplete. The same host carried additional services tied to campaign collection behavior, including OtterCookie-related infrastructure. That is enough. You do not need to exaggerate it. One thing I have learned from this investigation is that bad labels spread faster than bad facts. A bad fact can be checked. A bad label becomes the folder everything else gets dropped into. Call something the FTP server, and every later artifact gets compared against that name. Does it fit the FTP server? Does it relate to the FTP server? Is this another FTP thing? And that sounds harmless until the label starts hiding the actual structure. Because the campaign was not organized around our names, the operators did not care what we called their machines. They cared whether the machines worked. If one host could receive stolen files, run a web service, support an upload sync, or sit in the path for another malware family, then that is what mattered operationally. The label was our problem, not theirs. This is also why I do not like clean diagrams too early in an investigation. Clean diagrams feel good. They make the chaos look controlled. A box for the victim, a box for the malware, a box for command and control, a box for exfiltration, arrows between them. The problem is that real infrastructure does not always respect the diagram. A server can be a sink in one path and an active service in another. A development artifact can leak from a production deployment. A machine can be both operator infrastructure and victim record. A tool builder can appear through logs, while operators appear through session data. This whole series has been full of those overlaps. Episode 3 was about the factory eating its own workers. Episode 4 was about the operator machine that stayed readable long enough to become a record of its own use. This episode is smaller, but the lesson is related. The server was doing more than the first label allowed us to see. And once we admitted that, the infrastructure became less tidy and more useful. So what did the server actually show? Publicly, safely, the answer is this. It showed a collection point that had been used for stolen material. It showed structure in the way that material was organized. It showed operator workflow touching the same host. It showed non-FTP services on the same machine that could not be dismissed as interesting merely because they were open, but also could not be ignored once their behavior matched campaign collection patterns. And it showed OtterCookie-related infrastructure near the same collection surface that had already been tied to the older FTP story. That is the public version. The private version has more detail, and some of that detail stays private for good reasons. Live-looking credentials do not belong in a podcast. Victim rosters do not belong in a podcast. Exact access sequences do not belong in a podcast. If a detail lets someone reproduce collection, retrieve victim data, or interfere with active systems, it does not make the story better. It makes the story irresponsible. The useful thing for listeners is the model. A server can enter your notes through one role. That role can be real, and the server can still be more than that role. In this case, FTP was the first useful name. It was not the final classification. The final classification is uglier. Shared collection infrastructure. Less catchy, more accurate. And once you say it that way, you can see why the server mattered. It was not just where data landed. It helped connect parts of the campaign that otherwise might look separate. Beavertail era collection, invisible ferret-style FTP exfiltration, OtterCookie-related upload behavior, different tools, different collection methods, same operational neighborhood. That does not prove every component had the same operator at the keyboard. It does not prove every service was deployed at the same time. It does not prove intent beyond what the artifacts support. But it does show infrastructure reuse. And in threat intelligence, reuse is evidence. Not always attribution by itself, but evidence of how the operation was built. The second layer is not just OtterCookie. OtterCookie is part of it. The deeper point is that the campaign did not rely on one collection style. It had options. Some paths looked like classic file theft: collect, package, upload. Some paths behaved more like live malware infrastructure: check in, send data, receive tasks, persist, watch, collect again. That difference changes how defenders should think about it. If you only look for a repository lure, you miss the infrastructure. If you only look for the first stage payload, you miss the collection path. If you only watch FTP, you miss services that collect differently. If you only hunt one malware family, you miss the fact that another family may be sharing pieces of the same infrastructure model. That is why the server mattered. It forced us to stop treating the campaign like a single chain. It was not one clean line from fake recruiter to malicious repo to stolen files. It was more like a set of overlapping routes. Some routes went through FTP, some went through HTTP style upload behavior, some went through command and control, some went through operator machines, some went through panels and staging environments. And every time one route crossed another, the campaign became easier to understand. That is what happened here. The FTP server was not just a storage box, it was one of the places where routes crossed. Once you see that, the title almost becomes a confession. We called it the FTP server. We were not wrong. We were early. By this point, the server had stopped being a single object in the notes. It had become a place where several paths crossed. One path came from the old FTP story. Stolen material landed there. Operators knew how to reach it. The folder structure carried campaign meaning. Another path came from the non-FTP services. Some of them were ordinary noise, some were not. And then there was OtterCookie. Different tooling, different collection behavior, same infrastructure neighborhood. That is where the map changed. Not all at once, not with one perfect artifact that explained everything. It changed the way investigations usually change. One node stops fitting cleanly, then another, until the old name is still true but no longer useful. At first, the label helped. FTP server. Simple, searchable, easy to say. But after the second and third paths crossed the same host, that name started hiding the more important thing. The server was not interesting because it had FTP. It was interesting because FTP was only one role in a larger operating surface. And that is the moment where you have to redraw the diagram. Not because the first diagram was stupid, because the evidence got bigger than the diagram. The same thing had already happened earlier in the investigation. The infrastructure looked too clean, so we had to ask whether it was a honeypot. Then the victim data answered that question in a way the outer layer could not. The operation was real, the victims were real, but the first layer had still been misleading. This server forced the same kind of correction on a smaller scale. FTP was real, the collection rule was real, the operator workflow around it was real, but the machine was not only that. It was a crossing point between collection methods. And crossing points matter. They show where the operation reuses infrastructure. They show which parts the operators were comfortable placing together. They show where one malware family stops being isolated from another and starts sharing the same operational surface. That does not make the story cleaner. It makes it more useful. A clean story would say, here is the malware, here is the server, here is where the files went. The real story is messier. Here is a server that first looked like a file sync. Here are services that made that label too small. Here is another tool family touching the same surface. Here is the point where the map has to change. That is the turn in this episode. We did not discover a magic hidden box. We discovered that the box we had already named had more jobs than the name allowed. The lesson here is not scan every server. You already know that. The lesson is, do not let the first correct answer become the only answer. In defensive work, that mistake happens constantly. A machine is labeled a web server, so the EDR alert gets interpreted as web noise. A credential is labeled low privilege, so nobody asks what repository it can read. A compromised developer laptop is treated as an endpoint incident, so nobody checks what production systems that developer could reach. A server is labeled an FTP sink, so the rest of its behavior gets treated like clutter. The label is not always wrong. That is the dangerous part. The web server really is a web server. The low privilege credential really is low privilege in one system. The developer laptop really is one endpoint. The FTP server really is FTP. But attackers do not organize risk according to our labels. They organize around usefulness. What can this machine reach? What can it collect? What can it host? What can it hide next to? What can be reused? In the fake interview campaign, that usefulness often came from developer environments. But on the infrastructure side, it also came from consolidation. One host could be a collection point and a clue to another collection method. One server could sit between malware families. One boring label could hide a second layer. And that is why this episode matters. Not because the server was technically exotic. It was not. It matters because it shows how an investigation can be right and still incomplete. And if you stop at right, you may miss the part that matters. So where does that leave us? With a corrected label. Not the FTP server. Not anymore. The better name is less clean. Shared collection infrastructure. A host that entered the investigation through file transfer, but later connected to another layer of the campaign. It received stolen material. It carried structure. It sat in the operator workflow. And it exposed enough non-FTP behavior to show that the first name was too small. That is the uncomfortable thing about this kind of work. You spend a lot of time trying to name things. A malware family, a server, a cluster, a role, a person, a campaign. But names are temporary. They are placeholders until the evidence forces them to change. In this case, the evidence changed the name of one server, but it also changed the shape of the campaign around it. Because once the FTP server became shared infrastructure, the next question was obvious. If this host had another job, what else did the second layer contain? That is where we go next. OtterCookie. Not as a footnote, not as a sidecar, as its own part of the fake interview machine. The first label is not always wrong. Sometimes it is just too small. This was The Fake Interview. I'm Valhax. Stay skeptical and don't run strangers' code on your real machine. See you next time.